Thank you very much for joining us for the second episode of Water Losses 101, a discussion of common causes of water losses and how to investigate them, part two. Thanks again for tuning in to Subro Sessions. My name is Gus Sara, and I'm a subrogation attorney with White and Williams. Joined with me is the incredible engineer, Pablo Ross, owner of Ross Engineering. Again, say hello, Pablo.
Good afternoon, Gus. It is my pleasure being here today.
Welcome back. And also co-presenting with us yet again is the man, the myth, and still the legend, Michael DeBona, who runs the water loss program at White and Williams.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be back here for another episode.
So at the end of the last episode, Pablo was discussing the final steps he takes after his preliminary investigation and some of the things he does when he gets back to the office to complete his analysis. Now I'm going to start by giving the perspective of what the attorney does immediately after getting the verbal report from the expert and what we do on our end to complete the analysis and make the appropriate recommendations to the client. Then we're going to talk about the process of evidence lab examinations. And then we're going to discuss a few case examples that will tie in all the things that we talked about from the first part of the episode and the episode today. So now, from an attorney's perspective, I've got the verbal report from the engineer. If a potential target is identified, whether it's a manufacturer, contractor, or a maintenance company, it is then my job to determine the legal viability of a claim against these entities. For one, is the entity still in business? Is there applicable coverage? If we continue our investigation, which will involve the client incurring costs, then we want to make sure that there's a likelihood of actually recovering money at the end of the day from the target. So we need to place a target on notice and try to determine as early as possible if there's applicable liability coverage or some other prospect for recovery. We also want to make sure, among a lot of other things, that the claim is within the statute of repose period for that state. Most states have repose periods for improvements to real property, and a few states also have a repose period for products. The repose period limits the time one can sue from the point the work is substantially completed or when the product is either sold or delivered or first put to use, depending on the verbiage of the statute of repose in that state. There are several other legal considerations that need to be factored in, and we can't discuss all of them and exhaust them all here today. But an extremely critical part of our analysis is the review of any contracts related to the installation or service of the subject defect or water source. We are looking for any subrogation waivers, limitations of liability that pose challenges to recovery. These findings, along with our recommendations on how to proceed, are then promptly reported to the client. And at the same time this is all happening, we are researching the targets, we're sending them notice of a potential claim so that we can be prepared to schedule whatever inspections are requested or needed, whether it be a joint site inspection or if we roll right into a joint evidence examination. Typically, once a target is notified of the claim, either the target or its carrier will eventually request that the evidence be examined in a destructive testing during a joint lab examination. Pablo, when an evidence inspection is requested, what are typically the next steps for you?
Well, as we explained in the prior episode, once that a plan has been developed, the evidence has to be recovered. Sometimes the evidence will be recovered as part of a joint inspection where the parties that were placed on notice showed up, they have their representatives there, and they will provide their input as to the proper preservation of the evidence. So I will say that it's on everyone's best interest for the evidence to be properly extracted from the site for a future lab examination.
Now, Pablo, I do want to discuss a point that Michael and I were discussing a few days ago offline while we were preparing for this podcast. And that is evidence can be somewhat treated differently. Scene preservation could be perhaps approached differently and perceived differently between a fire loss and a water loss. And that possibly is because if the evidence is removed during a fire scene, that usually entails perhaps modification of the scene digging out of debris, and a significant alteration of the scene in order for that evidence to be extracted. Whereas in water losses, it appears, based on Michael's experience, that the spoliation defense is raised less when evidence is removed from a scene, perhaps because there's not much disruption entailed in just taking the evidence and then perhaps bringing it back for a joint inspection. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. If you think about it, once a fire starts, there's a point of origin. The fire is going to spread. As it spreads, it's going to destroy components that could be part of the origin system. Let's say electrical wiring. If the electrical wire starts igniting, and then it's going to take more wiring, which in turn is destroy more evidence along the way. In the case of a water loss, if you have a failure of a component of a pipe, let's say the pipe ruptures, once that pipe ruptures, the water by itself may not necessarily damage the water system. So you do have a better preservation of the evidence most times between a water loss versus a fire loss. And I think that's one of the reasons why the evidence can be better preserved as long as you get to it on time.
And of course, after the fact, should you need to, in Pablo's example, go back out to the site, you're still able to do that. Of course, you want to be in contact with your insured, the homeowner or the building owner, and make sure you know when they plan to make repairs, what extent of repairs, whether it be to the plumbing system or to the property damaged. But you also have the opportunity to go back out there in the future versus a fire scene, where, as Gus pointed out, the scene's going to be disturbed. Things that are altered 3 days from now, you can't put back into place after the fact.
And I was surprised to hear, Michael, that you've had instances, perhaps not every time, but some instances where manufacturers actually did not want to go back to the scene. Is that correct?
That is, yeah. And it may be surprising to some that are handling predominantly fire claims. It oftentimes doesn't matter on the size of the loss, whether it's a $10,000 loss or a multi-million dollar loss. You almost can't pay some of these manufacturers to come back to the site and further inspect. And sometimes, we could speculate the various reasons that is. For instance, they may know the product very well and know that it is defective and not need to come out to the site and look at things. There are other reasons as well, but it is much less an issue in the realm of water losses. There's differences. There are things that make water losses easier. This would be one of them. There are things that make water losses more complex than fire losses. But certainly in terms of spoliation, that is not the same issue that you see in fire losses. It arises more often in terms of lab exams down the road with what could be considered destructive in nature. But in terms of the scene, we more often want to ensure that we retain the evidence and we have it down the road and it's preserved for the entirety of the claim rather than maybe the site and holding the site. It's a little different than a fire claim in that regard.
Okay, so at the point where the parties are requesting a joint evidence examination, in my experience, typically a protocol of some sort for the examination, not all the time, but is typically requested. How does that play out for you, Pablo? And what's the best course of action, in your opinion, in dealing with protocols and working with the parties to come to an agreement? And what is a protocol?
Yes. So a testing protocol is the guidelines by which the specific evidence is going to be destructively tested. Destructive testing means that once I perform a specific test on this evidence, I will not have the opportunity to redo that test. The evidence will forever be altered. And since you only have one shot at it, you better make sure that you do it right. That's what a testing protocol is. I always recommend that a testing protocol be written by the expert prior to the joint exam, and that will have a series of steps. Let's say, for example, in the case of a pipe that ruptured or a pipe fitting, do you want to connect that pipe fitting to a water source and pressurize it and get an idea of how much water flow would be leaking out of that rupture? Is it 1 gallon a minute or is it 1 ounce a minute? Those are things that have repercussions as far as the investigation as it pertains to the spread of the damage of the loss. In addition to that, if you want to do any type of destructive testing, sometimes you have to section it, you have to cut it, you have to look at it, put it under a microscope. You may want to do more intrusive types of destructive analysis. You may want to cut out a part and send it for material testing, make sure that it's the proper composition of the material that the part is made out of. Those type of tests typically are specified on the testing protocol. That will be distributed to all the interested parties, and they will provide their own input because at the end of the day, As I said before, you only have one shot, so you want it to be done correctly. But at the same time, you want it to be done in accordance and in agreement with all the relevant parties. Let them comment on it, and you try to reach an understanding between the different experts to get to an agreement as to how that testing will proceed.
Is it typically the claimant's expert that should put together the draft of the protocol?
Yes, correct. Normally, the claimant's expert will be the one drafting the testing protocol. Yes. And then will be distributed to the other experts that will be on the possible list of targets or parties, whichever way you want to call it. They will provide their input and say if they agree or disagree with your testing. Most times between engineers, we can get to a collective agreement. And when you've been doing this for a while, you understand how things should be done and under what parameters they should be done. I always say that you have to test things and gather the data and get all the data that you can get. And then from that data, you will draw a theory and reach a conclusion.
Okay, Michael, I got a question for you. Has there ever been instances where the manufacturer has requested that you send them the evidence for some type of non destructive visual inspection before proceeding with a joint destructive testing? And if so, what's your general view of that and how do you deal with it?
That's a great question. I think that is something that happens much more frequently, I should say. It probably doesn't happen at all in fire cases, right? Because when you're shipping evidence that was involved in a fire, it's very fragile. Compared to a water loss, you can have a product that can be, in theory, shipped, and it's not going to disrupt or alter the product. So we do get manufacturers that will ask for the product to be shipped because they're trying to conserve costs and they want it to be put into the mail. From my perspective, that is certainly something that we could consider in the right claim. If it's a small dollar amount, that is something that maybe you want to consider. You have a good relationship with the manufacturer. It could expedite the resolution. So you would consider that. That's something that we talk to the client about. It is important to note, however, that we are making sure that we have an agreement in place with the manufacturer that transfers the risk that that goes lost or missing in the mail or that they alter it without our consent. So we're not shipping the evidence before we have that discussion with the manufacturer and they agree to accept all responsibility and liability for any of that risk. Now, sometimes we get some pushback to that, and that's fine. I understand why they wouldn't want to transfer the risk, right? It could be $100,000 loss, and if they don't want to take that risk to save $2,000 in a flight and some other engineering costs, that analysis makes sense. But on the flip side, we're not taking on that risk to save them $2,000. So if they're not agreeing to that, we're not putting in the mail, and it kind of ends there from our perspective. Now, one caveat, of course, is that it depends on the loss, what product is involved, the cost of the damages, the amount of the damages, our theory, if it's just the manufacturer, if we have installation claims, if there's going to be destructive testing down the road, all these things play into it. So just one example, if we know that we're going to have to conduct destructive testing in the near future, I'm going to be less likely, if not doing it at all, putting that in the mail for them to inspect it, right? We're going to schedule a destructive exam in the near future, and they're more than able to come out anytime before that destructive exam, including the day of the exam, and look at it before we take any destructive action to it. So it really depends on the facts and circumstances. But to answer your question, Gus, it is something that we would consider in the right case. And usually, if the damages are on the lower amount and we're trying to just be aware of the costs on both sides and try to bring the subrogation claim to a quick resolution.
Interesting and truly incredible response, Michael. Thank you for that. So, getting back to the joint evidence exam, Pablo, can you just generally, and I know it changes from examination to examination, but can you just generally explain to the listeners what happens during the joint evidence exam and the steps that typically take place?
Well, we typically have two types, whether it's a destructive exam or we have a joint site exam. But in the case of a joint lab examination, the first thing that happens is, according to my protocols, everyone signs in. They provide their name, contact information, and who they represent. In addition to that, the claimant's expert will provide some background information as to what happened, when it happened, some of the basic details so the other experts have an idea of the type of system and conditions under which the failure occurred. After that, since everyone previously obtained a copy of the testing protocol and they had a chance to comment on it, we will proceed according to the protocol. Sometimes manufacturers, when they show up for product inspections, for example, they may provide their own data to the investigator. Sometimes that is helpful. They will exchange or they will ask additional questions, which it will be up to the claimant's expert to provide. And then we will go by the protocol. Typically, the protocol starts with a visual, non destructive examination of the evidence. You can photograph it, you can take dimensions. Sometimes we may use different tools. We may use stereomicroscopy to get a close up section of a rupture, for example, if you have like a product that ruptured in two pieces and water leaked out of it. We may also get x rays of the product before we move on into more destructive parts of it. And that will help us in order to continue with the exam and see how we're going to analyze this section. And then we'll go from there. Now, typically, this data is shared within experts. Everybody that participated in the inspection, they will get a copy of the shared data. And one thing that every single testing protocol that I write, that it always has, is it always says that this protocol may be modified if agreed by attendees. And one thing that you find is that, sometimes you get, I wouldn't say unexpected results, but sometimes things happen that are not what were expected to happen. Maybe you open one part of a product and you found something that piqued your interest and now you want to move in that direction. Well, that may have not been covered on the original protocol. So that's why we would, as a group, we will reach a consensus and then we'll proceed as the group agrees to. And that may be in the interest of finding what happened. So you always have to be flexible and at the same time, keep your eyes open during the examination to see where the investigation is leading you to finally determine ultimately what is the root cause of that failure.
And when you get to a point where you have an aha moment and you feel like you've determined the potential cause of the failure, do you ever get a sense that the other experts kind of see what you're seeing? How does that work in the examination room? Is everyone closed lip? Are you seeing poker faces? Are you trying to determine from their facial expressions if they see the aha moment as you do?
Well, that's an interesting question for sure. And I think poker face is what comes to mind. Many times, people keep poker faces on, and sometimes it's obvious to most people, I would say, in the room. When you get to that aha moment, you realize that the group has gotten very close to determining what happened. There's different ways to look at it. Some people keep their cards close to their chest, some of them don't. From my point of view, I have to say that I let the data be the data and then you draw your conclusions from there. But when you get to those aha moments as a forensic engineer, I think for me it's very satisfying because I see this as a series of puzzles that have to be determined. And I like solving puzzles. So getting to that point is one of the best parts of this whole forensic engineering process.
Similar question, Pablo. When you're going through the exam, and you mentioned a few moments ago about having to sometimes go in a different direction based on what you're finding, or obviously there's conversations you're having with the experts who are in attendance. Are you able to detect where maybe the adverse expert is going with their defense based on what they're saying they want to do or what they're seeing? So, similar to what Gus was saying, the pick up on the aha moment and whether they're in agreement with you, do you see where they're either in disagreement or where they're maybe trying to bolster their defense based on what they're asking to do?
Well, as far as bolstering their defense, sometimes I've come into situations where some experts do not want to proceed with a specific test because they're afraid of what they might find. I'll say this a third time. Let the data be the data. Just get as much data as you can and let the chips fall where they may. You know, whether is you find that one party was at fault, whether you find that your own insured maybe could have done something. I've had investigations where you go to that process and then, you may find out that an insurer, for example, they told you, oh no, I definitely protected the home. I definitely kept it heated. And then let's say you find an issue where, it might have been your insured's fault. Well, in that regard, let the data be the data. I think that some experts may try to skew things one way. I just say, rather than walk a certain way through the forest, let's just look at all the trees and see where they fall.
So, whenever I tell the client that there's a joint evidence examination, they're usually calling me either the same day or the day of to say, what's the total conclusion of this case? Do you typically reach the point where you have an opinion and a conclusion or a theory of liability at the end of that exam, or do you typically need a few days or even longer to process it or perhaps do additional research? How does that usually fall out for you?
In most cases, by the time you get to the lab exam, you should have an indication of what the root cause is going to be, because you have to think that the testing protocol was written in order to determine what that root cause was. I would say that at the end of that destructive examination, you should have a pretty good idea. That's not to say you always know exactly what happened at the end of that exam. Sometimes you need some follow up. Sometimes you may find something through the testing that necessitates further testing, or you may need to check some things out. You may need to get some additional information just to hone in on what that theory of failure is. But most times, by the end of the lab exam, you should have a pretty good idea what happened.
Okay, now we'd like to discuss some examples of water losses that we've had that tie in some of the elements that we've discussed in this series and identify some common problems that we run into. The first one I like to call the insured knows best scenario. And this example illustrates how sometimes the building owner will be adamant about a particular cause of the loss, not having any expertise to even render such an opinion, and that the investigation by the actual forensic engineer reveals that the cause is actually something entirely different. So Pablo and I had a recent water loss claim at a residence where the water source was a bathroom sink on the first floor. And I believe it was a disconnection of a fitting for the sink faucet. And the sink was connected to a central water filtration system and perhaps other systems. I'll let Pablo elaborate on that. But the homeowner initially explained that she had experienced power outages in the area over the last few weeks. It was obvious that she was frustrated by the series of power outages and certainly had a bone or two to pick with the electric utility. And she had explained that there was a power outage on the morning of the actual water loss, just hours before, and that the water loss was discovered shortly after the power was restored to the home. And the insured was certain that the water loss was caused by a water hammer resulting from the restoration of power. And I'll let Pablo clean up the engineering side of that and discuss his findings, which were contrary to the homeowner.
Yes, thank you, Gus. So basically, the property that it's in a semi-rural area, and it has a domestic water system that is provided by a well pump. So they have an electrical well pump that extracts water from the ground and it pumps it into the house and it goes through a filtration system. And in this case, she did have problems with the electric utility. She did have, I wouldn't call them surges, but she did have frequent outages at her house. Now, keep in mind, the well pump is electric. It is controlled by an electronic controller that is in her main mechanical room. And that also controls the water source. So basically, if her theory was that since she had an outage on the day of the loss, and she also just so happened to have had this water damage that same morning, she assumed that the two were connected. That's not to say that, that could not happen, but of course, that's when your investigation has to take into account all systems, as we are talking before on the first episode. As an electromechanical engineer is something that, it really helps to understand the different systems. Is not just a water system, is just not an electrical system. You have to understand how these systems work together. In this specific case, we even had video of the event. So, and we also had the electronic controller actually had a database, an error log of when things occurred. We were able to download the error log from the controller from the pump. We're able to ascertain that, yes, in fact, there was a power outage. I wouldn't call it a surge, but there was a power outage that lasted a few seconds that morning. The actual cause of the loss in this case was identified to be a installation issue, is what I would say, and an improper installation that resulted in the water release. Now, how do you explain that the outage was not related to the water damage? Well, the reason you do that is by taking a comprehensive look at the plumbing system, we were able to determine that number one, the domestic water supply is protected by a check valve. A check valve is something that I call a one-way valve. It's kind of like a one-way street. Once water flows into the house, it cannot get out of the house. So in this case, the check valve isolated the supply from the pump and the water from inside of the house. Right next to the check valve, they had something called an expansion tank that allows for expansion of the water. As we all know, if you heat water, it's going to expand, and that expansion is going to create a pressure increase. Water is something that I call an incompressible fluid. So the expansion tank was right at the location of where the water supply to the house was, and is essentially a shock absorber. The pressure surge that she thought was caused by the pump, would have resulted in an increase of abnormal pressure inside of that plumbing system. We also determined through our investigation that this specific system had a pressure relief valve. What a pressure relief valve does, relieves the water pressure. It allows the water pressure to come back to a normal level in the event of a pressure surge. Not only did we have one pressure relief valve, we actually had two because the domestic hot water also had a pressure relief valve. So if you go by the theory that the pressure surge was created by the electrical outage, an abnormal pressure would have been relieved by not one, but two pressure relief valves located in the plumbing system. So, was it a coincidence? Yes, coincidences do happen. However, you have to look at the physical evidence. By downloading the error log, we're able to ascertain what was the maximum pressure at that event. And the maximum pressure was within normal limits of the set points for that system.
So you came to the determination that the cause of the failure was an improper connection of a fitting for the faucet.
That is correct. Yes, we were able to determine that the failure mode was related to an improper plumbing installation rather than an electrical outage that could have caused a malfunction of the pump controller.
And now this kind of serves as a cautionary tale because when we received the loss, there were notes in the claims file about this being a utility related issue. And now, if we end up litigating the case against the plumbing contractor that installed the faucet, we're going to have to deal with those initial claims notes indicating and potentially implicating the electric utility, which may lead the defense counsel for the plumbing contractor down a rabbit hole that's going to be inconvenient for all of us and cause delay in recovery efforts. So, there's always a risk to taking a little too seriously what the building owner tells you is the cause of the loss. And for anyone listening, perhaps that's something to keep in mind.
And to add on that and actually relate it back to our last episode last month, we were discussing manufacturers often like to throw out the defense that product's 5 years old, it failed from wear and tear, that product's 7 years old, it failed from age. People have independent from manufacturers, right? People have all sorts of preconceived notions of how long a product should last, or after a product fails, they just write it off as being an issue due to age of the product, but it has nothing to do with that. There's an underlying defect, and that thing would have lasted another 5, 10, 15, 20 years had that defect not existed. So similarly, when we're getting claims in and there may be a notion, oh, it just failed from age or wear and tear, or we don't have any subrogation potential. And that, in fact, is not at all the case, right? And it's easy to compare certain product failures to just products that we deal with on an everyday basis, right? Your computer that you're on right now, your cell phone, your car. When they reach the end of their useful life, they just die out. They may stop working, but that doesn't mean they're going to catastrophically fail, result in an explosion in the example of your car, or a fire with your computer, or water loss with your supply line or valve or faucet. So it's just something else to consider when you're getting these files in and you're investigating, to really take it at face value what you're hearing from others.
And Pablo, one of the final thoughts that I'd like to talk about is at what point do you, because there are instances where you realize, okay, maybe we need to bring in another expert, right? You get a copper line failure and you might need to do some SEM testing or studying of metals, and you need some type of metallurgical analysis, or there's a question about what a plumber should have done. and you may need a standard of care expert. At what point do you make that determination, and how do you go about bringing that to the attention of the subrogation advocate?
Yes. Well, as you follow along with the investigation and you do your testing and you get your results, you have to be aware of where the investigation is leading. You have to understand what the possible failure mode may be, and therefore you have to recognize whether or not you are able to, you yourself as a forensic engineer in a specific field, if you're able to reach that conclusion yourself. You spoke about, a metallurgist, for example. Yes, there are many losses where, the product may crack or ruptured, and you do testing and you may find traces of a materials defect. Plastic fittings is a big example. Why specifically did the plastic fitting rupture? Once that you have eliminated, for example, was the pressure okay? Was the installation proper? Were the standards met as far as the conditions in which this was operating? Was the service inspected and repaired properly? Once you start seeing that, well, this could be a material defect, that's when you have to raise a flag and contact your client, your attorney, and tell them, well, look, this looks like you may need to get a materials expert involved. Let them pick up the investigation testing from that point on and let them reach the conclusion. It's not something that, you have to recognize what your knowledge is and what you need from others in order as a collective effort to reach a proper conclusion.
All right. As much as I would love to continue to go on and on about this very interesting topic, we have to bring this to a closure. We really hope that you found this valuable. I know I sure did. I truly believe the first episode really laid the groundwork, and that this episode had a lot of meat and potatoes. And I can't thank Pablo enough for sharing his insight on the investigation process. I want to thank everybody again for joining us for the second part of Water Losses 101. Will there be a third part? Perhaps. Only time will tell, but we'll wait for your feedback to see if the people demand it. We hope you found the information insightful. And again, we really appreciate your continued support for Subro Sessions. Thanks for listening to this episode of Subro Sessions. Be sure to listen to the next episode of Subro Sessions, which will be released on the third Tuesday of next month, August 20th. In this case, you could find the past episodes of the podcast and relevant case updates on the Subrogation Strategist blog, all available at whiteandwilliams.com. Thanks again.
We would like to remind everyone that the contents of this podcast are intended for general informational purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation with respect to any specific legal question you may have. The podcast should not be construed as legal advice for a particular situation or to give a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.